Well, welcome to another of our NWBA online reflections, and however you're joining us, wherever you're joining us from, I hope that you're doing okay. We are facing some real challenges again as more seasons of lockdown seem to be coming our way, and many people's health is really being threatened and damaged at the moment. So I hope that these short reflections are helping you make your way through these troubled times. There are certain companies who just manage to get their corporate logo everywhere. I guess one prime example of that is McDonald's. I doubt if there are many retail parks left where you don't get to see those golden arches inviting you to join the queue for the drive-through. And of course, the other ubiquitous one has got to be Coca-Cola. Rumour has it that until they came along, Father Christmas was dressed in green, and even he succumbed to their corporate power and switched to bright red. And when you see a football manager being interviewed at the end of a game, people have paid serious money to get their logos on the wall that they're standing in front of. But if you wanted to ask who invented the corporate logo, you might say that actually it was the church, because just about wherever you are in the world, you can see that familiar symbol of the cross, and you recognize that the building or the book or whatever it's attached to in some way or other has a Christian identity. And that symbol of the cross has been used in that way for centuries. But of course, we have to recognise that it wasn't the church who came up with the cross as a symbol. It was the Roman Empire, and the simple truth is that it served as a much more gruesome corporate logo, as Rome's execution method of choice, because it was horrible and it was painful, and its purpose was to frighten people into complying with the dictates of the Roman state. And through his crucifixion, Jesus transformed this symbol of oppression and death into a symbol of hope. And over time, Christians came to recognize that the cross is also a symbol of salvation, as it became not simply a place of execution, but a place of willing sacrifice, where our wrongs were righted and our forgiveness was granted. And that in itself may cause us to stop and recognize that a symbol, even the cross, only gains its meaning from how people engage with and understand its message and how they respond to its message. But for all that that's true, it is incredible how much meaning can be invested in such a simple symbol. And yet, I guess too, that it's become so commonplace as people wear it as jewellery or have it emblazoned on their t-shirts, that it can also lose a great deal of that meaning. Not, of course, because it is meaningless, but because we can be thoughtless in the way that we use and display this profound symbol of faith and hope. Anyhow, I haven't put this talk together to start criticising the way the cross is used in our mainstream culture, but perhaps we could use that recognition to think about whether even those of us who might describe ourselves as faithful and serious followers of Jesus can become so familiar with the sign of the cross that we too begin to risk forgetting its full meaning or allowing it to impact our lives as much as it should. And if it stops impacting our lives, then it's bound to stop impacting the lives of others. So if we want to see people taking the message of the cross seriously, then we have to live lives that encourage that to happen. Someone who really wrestled with the meaning of the cross was the New Testament apostle and writer St. Paul. His background was in the Jewish law, and it was he, probably more than anyone else in the early years of the church's life, who began to draw out these deeper meanings of the cross. It was he who remembered how in Old Testament times people would make sacrifices as a way of expressing their sorrow for their wrongdoing and seeking God's forgiveness and seeking to put things right. And it was he who therefore began to recognize how on the cross Jesus had become that sacrifice and had achieved the forgiveness and the salvation that are such central elements in our Christian faith today. But for all of that, Paul never lost sight of the human cost of the cross. He never forgot that alongside all of that, it was an act of utter selflessness and infinite love. And when he was writing to the church in Philippi, he made the point that the cross is also intended to be our example. That if we seriously stop and take in all that the cross means, if we don't allow ourselves to be so familiar with it that we forget what it stands for, we cannot help but be inspired by that example. And that attitude of utter selflessness that conveyed Jesus to the cross, is an attitude that he commends to each of us. Anyhow, don't take my word for that. Let's look at what he has to say. So I want to invite us to listen to the words of Philippians chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 6 to 8. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And from there, Paul goes on to recognize how Jesus is then exalted and becomes the name that is above every name. Let your attitude be the same as that of Jesus. That is some challenge. But it's a challenge that we need to take seriously. And in the verses that follow, Paul spells out what that looks like in our everyday lives and behaviour. And so I want to pick this up again, this time at verse 12. And this is what he says. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. Now, this reflection is one of a number that we're putting together that is largely inspired by the words of Jesus declared on the final evening of his earthly life, recorded in John chapter 13, where Jesus says, "This is how the world will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." You know, there's a reason that companies like Coca-Cola and McDonald's invest so much in their corporate logos and have them dotted all over their stores and their products and their lorries and billboards and TV adverts and just about everywhere else. Because they want to stand out. They want to be the first people that we think of when we want a drink or a burger. And in these verses from Philippians, we are invited to have the same impact, to shine like stars, as Paul puts it. And we stand out, not by putting up neon signs or investing in huge advertising hoardings, but by living lives that are inspired by the example of Jesus. Yes, the cross is a universal symbol that is recognized just about all over the world. But if we want it to have meaning and impact, then we are called to live lives that reflect that meaning by having the same attitude that took Jesus to the cross. This is how the world will know that you are my disciples, says Jesus, not by the success of your advertising campaigns or the effectiveness of your outreach program, but by showing the same love to one another that I've showed to you. And here, Paul is speaking to us, not simply as individuals, but as a community. The letter is to the Philippians. It's a letter to the church. And he's talking about the culture of that church's life when he says, do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may become blameless and pure. And take it seriously. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Don't take it lightly. So I want to invite you to spend a few moments just reflecting on the cross and looking at the cross through these verses from Philippians. Yes, it is a very familiar symbol, and the chances are that even if you're just an occasional churchgoer, it probably won't take you too long to find one somewhere around the house. And you might like to do that, you might not. Maybe in your jewellery box, or on a card or a poster, or perhaps even on the front of your church newsletter if they've managed to deliver one to you. But maybe today, don't just see the cross and then turn your attention elsewhere, but just take some time to ponder what the cross means. Start by thinking about what it meant for Jesus to allow himself to be taken to the cross and why he was prepared to do that. Think about the love and the selflessness that Jesus expresses towards us by doing that, and let that all too familiar symbol of the cross speak to you again about Jesus. And then, when you've had time to really hold that in your mind, ponder those words, let your attitude be the same as that of Jesus. And perhaps hear what Paul goes on to say later. Work out your faith with fear and trembling. Hold firmly to the word of life. In different ways, each of these phrases expresses the fact that this isn't some instant thing that we just turn on. It requires effort and commitment. But it's not an effort and commitment that is ours alone to make. It is God who works in you, he says in verse 13, in order to fulfill his good purpose. So perhaps that can be your prayer for this week. God, help me to have that attitude, work within me, and help me to live a life that is a shining example of the attitude of the cross. And this is not about beating yourself up or wanting you to feel guilty or wretched, but inviting you to be open to God's Spirit, to equip and shape you according to his purpose. And then, thirdly, how can we become a community that is defined by the cross? As I said earlier, this is a letter that is addressed to a community of believers, and all of us are affected by our interactions with others and the nature and the tone of those interactions. It's part and parcel of being human. And when we think about the situation that we're in right now, there is a great deal that might cause us to grumble and complain. Times are tough, and human nature often expresses itself through our frustrations. And these negatives can become contagious. So maybe we do need to pray for ourselves as a church too. Loving God in a world where it is so easy to join in with the negatives and the frustrations, help us to be those who do not grumble and complain. Help us to express the meaning that we see in the cross through the way that we function as a community of believers. And I guess that's something of what Paul means when he invites us to shine like stars, to be those who stand out as a contrast. Let the way you behave, let the way that you reflect the message of the cross be what marks you out as different, he says to the Philippian Christians. Let that be the thing that makes you stand out in the darkness. You know, we began this reflection by talking about corporate logos, and let's face it, some companies invest a great deal of money in their branding and their logos because, quite frankly, their products aren't actually that good. And it's only the logo and it's only the branding that actually makes them stand out. But for us, that is not what the cross is for. Yes, okay, we do use it as a symbol to express our identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it will very quickly become a meaningless symbol unless its example and its message is reflected by the way in which we act and relate as God's people. So let's pray that God will help us to live that out. And maybe just spend some time in your reflections this week thinking about what that might mean for you. When Paul turns the attention of the early believers to the cross, he challenges them in a very simple way. Let your attitude be the same as that of Jesus. Because as Jesus himself had said some years earlier, this is how people will know that you are my disciples, if you display the same love for one another that I have displayed for you. Thanks for listening.